Poole Spiritualist Church on this very wonderful evening. If it's your first time in our beautiful church, I'd like to extend that warm hand of friendship to you, and I'm sure you'll enjoy our beautiful evening this evening. Spiritualism started, ladies and gentlemen, with physical phenomena with the Fox sisters, and after it began, it grew from strength to strength to strength. Many, many physical mediums gave such wonderful evidence to many scientists and many skeptics and proved the continuity of life. Even in this church, ladies and gentlemen, we have a family, or we had a family called the Wandresses, and they unfortunately lost, I think it was 6 of their children. They had 6 children and they lost all of them to spirit. And they went to Stansted Hall, and through the amazing mediumship of Gordon Higginson, who some of you may remember, who was a physical medium, each one of those children materialised and proved that they're still alive. Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. And I think it's especially wonderful because when the parents themselves passed away, when it came their turn to pass, they left all of their many, many millions of pounds to Stansted Hall to allow them to continue with the good work. So you see the sort of impact that physical phenomena has had on the movement. It's been absolutely incredible. Well, we have a gentleman here this evening who I have had the pleasure to sit with several times, and the impact of his mediumship, I think, has also been incredible. He is a gentleman who has been the president of the Noah's Ark Society. He's been the archivist for the Noah's Ark Society. He has been on a spiritual journey within physical mediumship for over 41 years. Well, I think it's just 41 years now. So he's very, very experienced, very, very knowledgeable, and very, very gifted. I had the great pleasure not only of witnessing his mediumship on several occasions, but also listening to a wonderful talk that he gave at Paynton Church on his experiences of many mediums over the years, or stories of mediums over the years. So I'm sure you're going to have a fabulous evening. Would you please give a wonderful Bournemouth welcome to Stuart Alexander. The evening over to Stuart. Thank you, Stuart.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Can you all hear?
Yes.
Right, okay. Good evening.
Good evening.
I'd like to begin, if I may, by just saying thank you to Jeff for that very kind, warm and generous introduction. Thank you. And also to thank Jeff and the committee of the church for kindly inviting me to come along here this evening and to share with you all something of my journey this past 41 years through spiritualism and particularly through physical mediumship. Now, I've had to write a few headings down because I want to make sure that I get everything in chronological order. And if I don't make notes at my age, unfortunately, I tend to forget what I'm talking about. So my journey began 41 years ago, and if I can just say that I was born into a family who knew nothing whatsoever about spiritualism. There was no connection whatsoever with spiritualism. And then 41 years ago, my brother Mike was in a second-hand bookshop in the city of York. And there at the bottom of a dusty pile of books, he came across one which was entitled On the Edge of the Etheric. Now, I'm sure that many of you here know exactly what On the Edge of the Etheric was about. It subsequently became spiritualism's all-time bestseller. Is there anyone here who has not heard of the book? Oh, a few people. Well, let me just very quickly explain that it was published in the early 1930s. It was written by a man called Arthur Finlay. Arthur Finlay, in later life, bequeathed Stansted Hall, his home, to the Spiritualist National Union. Now, back in the late 1920s, knowing nothing about spiritualism, he was invited to take part in a séance with a trumpet medium by the name of John Campbell Sloan. And at that very first sitting, that very first séance, he had the pleasure of suddenly finding himself speaking directly to his deceased father. And there was no question whatsoever in Finlay's mind that this was his father that he was speaking to. And as a result of that, he went on to write On the Edge of the Etheric. Now, my brother Mike, finding this book, decided to buy it. It was 2 and sixpence. Being tight, they decided to buy it. But no, that's not the real reason. The real reason is that he had, and he still has, a very inquiring mind, and he wanted to know what the etheric was. He had absolutely no idea. So he parted with this 2 and sixpence. Had he not parted with the money, then I wouldn't have been stood here now speaking to you, and you wouldn't have been sat there listening to me. And indeed, I wouldn't have enjoyed the extraordinary experiences that I've had within spiritualism this past 41 years. Many of those things I'd like to share with you all tonight. So Mike bought the book, took it home, read it, passed it to me. I read it, and I remember thinking at the time that if these things really did happen, if only a few of these things happened, then this was unbelievable, because spiritualism to me had always been nonsense. You know, people who know nothing about the subject always picture old ladies sitting around tables asking, is there anyone there? And that was my thought. That was my thought. And it was incredible. And I thought, well, if only half of this is correct, then this is something everyone should really know about. And that really ignited my interest, and ignited my brother Mike, his interest also. And from that day on, we began to read as much as we could about spiritualism, but particularly about physical mediumship. That had ignited our interest, and we couldn't read enough about it. I think because of the fact our introduction was through On the Edge of the Etheric, which dealt with physical mediumship, that was the main attraction for us. And for many months, we read everything that we could get hold of. And then eventually, we began to attend the local spiritualist church. I have to say that was interesting. I should also point out that during this 41 years journey, I've met many people who I think have enriched my life. A lot of people at whose feet I've learnt such a great deal. I've also got to say that there is a balance to that, because I've also met many people who I thought were damned idiots, quite frankly. You know, people who profess to know a great deal about spiritualism. And I always think, isn't it extraordinary that people who profess to know such a great deal always have thousands of words to say, to give out the wisdom freely. And very often I found myself thinking, but this is nothing about what Arthur Finlay wrote about. This is not the nitty-gritty of spiritualism. And it rather put me in mind, whenever I heard these people speak, of what the early established church must have been like. It was simplicity itself. The message was simplicity. And then officialdom came along, the priesthood came along, and what was simplicity suddenly became... Hi, Dave. All right. Just noticed it. It suddenly became complex. And from that day on, everybody's been trying to understand what it's all about. And I think it's the same with spiritualism. Its message is simplicity itself, and yet we tend to overcomplicate things. I've never understood it. So we visited the local spiritualist church and went there for many, many months. And then I always tend to think that my involvement in spiritualism, there have been certain kind of signposts or events on the way, on this journey, which have been very significant to me. And I remember attending the church on one occasion. We'd probably been going there for 6 months or a year or something like this, and after the service a lady approached us and she said, we've seen you at the church on many occasions. She said, we have a home circle. My husband is a trance medium. 2 people have left the circle. We wonder if you and your brother would like to come along. And of course, we'd never witnessed trance mediumship. Never witnessed trance mediumship before, and we thought this was too good an opportunity to miss. So the following Monday, my brother Mike and myself went along to this private house, and were shown into the lounge, very big lounge, and I suppose there was about 20 people there. and all regular members of the circle. And we all sat in a circle configuration. I'd never attended a séance before. We all sat with our backs to the wall in a circle, and after a while the medium came in, took his seat, chatted to everyone, and then a few moments later the light was dimmed and the evening was opened in prayer, and then his head fell on his chin fell onto his chest, and then for the next hour we had the scientist or the priest or somebody speaking to us. I never understood a word of it, but nevertheless speaking to us. Everybody seemed to know because everybody was nodding intelligently, and I was thinking, well, what's it all about? I never understood. but this went on for about an hour, and after the hour he came out of trance, and then his wife always went round the circle anti-clockwise, and she would ask everyone, have you seen anything, heard anything, experienced anything, did you sense anything? We want to know. And she would go around always anti-clockwise, and every single person she went to would say, oh yes, I could see so-and-so, oh yes, I clearly heard something, or I've sensed something, all the way around till she came to me. And then I would say, no. And then my brother and he would say, no. And then we would carry on. Well, we went there for many months. Every week we went, and every week was the same thing. We were mediumistically, we had no gift between us, nothing, believe me. We never saw anything, heard anything, witnessed anything other than these people coming and speaking through the trance medium. So naturally, both of us thought, my brother and myself, thought that psychically or mediumistically we were no hopers. There was nothing there. And then we decided to leave after about, I suppose, about a year. I think through embarrassments, and we decided to leave. And then I decided that we would form our own home circle. Now, we live in a semi-detached house with a large bay window in the lounge. We decided we would hold the séances in the lounge, but because of what we'd read with Arthur Finley's On the Edge of the Etheric, we realised that if we were going to sit for physical phenomena, then the room had to be in total and absolute darkness. Do you all understand the reason why generally people sit in darkness at physical séances? Good. Well, even if you don't, I'll explain as we go along. So I believe, I may be wrong here, but I believe it was on a Tuesday evening. I used to arrive home from work, and then I used to set about totally blacking out this lounge. Now, if anyone has ever tried to totally eliminate light from a room, you know how difficult it is, almost impossible. And I used to work for about 2 hours trying desperately to black out this room, and always succeeded. Now, it was a family circle, and the next door neighbours, they used to come in because they were interested. We sat in a circle, and there's the trumpet that sat in the middle of the circle, the very one which is still used today, and it was placed in the centre of the circle, and we played music. We opened in prayer, as we understood you had to do, and we all sat in a circle with music playing, and we sat for an hour. Nobody ever saw anything, nobody heard anything, nobody experienced a thing. We just sat there looking at the trumpet, perhaps willing it to move, but it never did. Not even a millimetre, it never moved. And so we used to sit, and I suppose, in a way, these became social events as well. And we were very serious in what we were doing, very serious, but at the same time, they became social events. And I would always say to any circle, people who were sitting in a home circle, I would always say, it's important, obviously. If we get results, that's the cherry on top of the cake. But if results always elude us, then where else can we every week meet together as friends and be as one, to be together, to lock the door, to shut outside the outside world? We all have our worries and our concerns, of course we do, but those do not belong in the séance room. Those belong outside, and you never take them into the séance room. So the door's closed, you sit together in harmony, and that is priceless, because in today's troubled world, to find peace together, to be like-minded, to be in harmony with each other, that's wonderful. And so therefore, I always say, even if people achieve nothing in terms of communication with the other world, then you've lost nothing. Not really. You've gained a great deal. You've been together in love and in harmony, and that's what it's all about. That's the building brick, which hopefully may lead on to eventual communication with the spiritual world. So we sat together for a long, long time, and then the next extraordinary event occurred, which was perhaps the opening of a floodgate. And I can remember this as clear as clear. At the time, I used to work part-time at a garage. And one particular night, I used to work from 6 o'clock till 8 o'clock to relieve the manager, the owner of the garage, so he could go home and have tea, and then he would come back, and then I would go home. And this particular night, 10 to 8, the phone rang. And I picked the phone up, and it was my brother. And he said, Sue and I, that was his wife at the time, Sue and I are thinking of having a seance. So would you like to come round? We're going to have a bit of a sitting. And I can remember I was very tired that night. And I said to him, well, no, Mike. I said, I'm so tired. I said, ring me tomorrow morning and let me know if anything happened. And I put the phone down, and I can remember thinking, if I don't go around there, he'll be ringing me tomorrow morning saying, guess what? Well, I never want to lose an opportunity. So I picked the phone up, rang him and said, look, Mike, I said, I'll be there. Don't start till I get there. So I went round. And I can always remember, and we sat in a dim red light, and we sat at a table. And I was sat at the head of the table, my sister-in-law was sitting there, and Mike was sitting there, and we put our hands on the table, and we sat. And we always used to sit for an hour. And I suppose 58 minutes passed, and my thoughts were beginning to turn to the cup of tea and the biscuits that we always had. And that was the highlight of these nights, believe me. And we were sitting there, and I suppose 58 minutes had passed, and suddenly I heard a voice as clear as a bell say, and it was in my left ear, and it said, switch the light out, continue to sit. And the extraordinary thing is, I didn't find that extraordinary in any way. I wasn't startled by it, but this voice very clearly continued to repeat. It was like a loop on a tape, a magnetic tape. Switch the light out, continue to sit. Switch the light out, continue to sit. Switch the light out. And this went on and on and on. And then my brother suddenly said, shall we bring it to an end and put the kettle on? And I said, no, just switch the light out, Mike. And he reached up and he switched the light out, and now I have a problem. The problem is, how does one describe the indescribable? And I don't know the answer to that. But instantly, as that light went out, so something came from behind me towards me. Now, has anybody seen the film Ghost with Whoopi Goldberg?
Yeah.
Right. You remember that scene where that spirit person jumps into her? Well, literally, it was like that. And this, whatever it was, came to her, and as it came towards me, everything in my entire body, every nerve, every muscle began to twitch and jump. And suddenly, he was there and I was outside, and I heard myself talking from a distance, saying, I come, speak, brother, sister. Just those few words, but those few words were the beginning. Unbelievable, absolutely unbelievable. And no sooner had they been said than whatever it was, he was, came out, and as he came out, so I found myself back in. And a few moments later, the light went on. We sat in relative silence, drinking tea and eating biscuits. Hardly anything was said. I went home, and the next morning, as I was walking into the office, the phone was ringing. And I picked it up, and it was my brother. And he said, are you coming round for a sitting tonight? And I replied, not bloody likely. I can honestly say that was the first and the last time that I was ever frightened in a seance room. I've never ever been frightened since, but literally I was very, very nervous about what had taken place. And I can tell you that as we continued to sit, if Whitefeather, as I came to know him, was going to control me, it was always in the first 2 or 3 minutes. If he didn't come, then we'd sit for the hour and nothing would happen. And so we continued to sit, and it was a long journey. And I should tell you at this point, because this is important for what I shall tell you later, whenever he did come, the first thing that would happen was that that left hand became almost deformed. It would curl in on itself. Quite an extraordinary thing. It still happens now, but not to the same extent as it used to happen then. And that's important to remember for what I'm going to tell you in a few moments. So then we reached a point in the home circle where we couldn't continue to sit as a circle. It became difficult. We had children, so on, so on, and so forth. These things happen. Then I was invited to... I was looking for another circle to sit in, and I was invited at the church, the same church, I was invited by an elderly couple to join their circle. They'd heard that I was developing transmediumship. And I should tell you, incidentally, because this is important to remember as well, that this guy, this elderly gentleman, suffered from gout. Now, gout, as you know, can be a very painful thing. And he suffered from gout, and the church, he used to have to go up the stairs to the church, and I always remember he used to struggle getting up these stairs. So I accepted the invitation. I thought, well, it gives me the opportunity to continue with my development. So I joined the circle. What I didn't know at the time, and what I did find out from him, was that he had been the transmedium for many years with this circle, of his circle. But for some reason, some months earlier, he'd lost the ability to go into trance. And really, I was there as a bit of a stopgap, if you like, and I understood from the beginning that as soon as his trance returned, he always used to say, one day it will return, and I realised that when that happened, then I would have to move on. And so I sat with the circle for quite some time, and it was very interesting. My development continued. We sat around a table, always around this table, and then I sat for several months. And then on one occasion, one night, I couldn't go, and the next morning the phone rang, and it was a lady from the circle who I knew quite well, and she said to me, I said, oh, what happened last night? She said, oh, well, she said, I'm going to call him Frank. She said, oh, Frank went into trance last night. So I said, oh, fantastic. She said, well, no, not really. And immediately I'm thinking, oh, my God, you know, was he taken ill or what's happened? So I said, well, what do you mean, not really? She said, well, she said, I found myself, she said, I was sitting on his right-hand side. She said, he fell into trance. She said, this Indian guard came through, and for 15 minutes, the Indian guard was talking quite eloquently. She said, and I don't know how this happened. She said, but I must have moved my foot and put it on his foot, so alongside his foot, his gout. She said, and as I did so, she said, instantly, she said, the guard stopped speaking. He turned to me, and out the corner of his mouth, he said, you're standing on my foot. I mean, it's bizarre. You know, it's bizarre, but it's true. You know, she said, I moved my foot, and he carried on. I thought, well, it's time to leave, so I left and I never went back. But I thought, well, these are the bizarre things within spiritual. They exist, you know, and we'd be foolish if we turned our backs on them. They do exist. I don't know the answer, but that certainly happened. So then, yeah. Yeah, I suppose, like all trance mediums, had a very big problem for the first few years that I was involved in the development. And the problem I had was the fact, one moment I accepted that Whitefeather was who he claimed to be, totally independent of me, and then the next moment I would think, it's a secondary personality, it's an aspect of myself. Now the point is that nobody wants to deceive themselves, and certainly nobody wants to deceive other people, and this is a problem. And most developing trance mediums, if they're honest, will say that they are aware of what is said through them. You know, a lot of people say, no, I don't know anything. Well, it's easier to say that. But the truth is that most trance mediums know something of what is happening. And that was my big problem. I heard everything that was always said by Whitefeather. And I used to think, is this, am I producing this in order to meet expectation? What is, you know, it can't possibly be, we've wanted it for so long and now it's happened. Is he really who he claims to be? And so one night, my wife was leaving for night school, and I said to her, write something down on a piece of paper, seal it up, put it in an envelope, seal it up, give it to me. I said, and I'm going to ask Whitefeather what you've written. I said, and if he can tell me what you've put, I said, I shall never ever doubt him again. And so she wrote something on a piece of paper, put it in an envelope, sealed it up, gave me it, and off she went to night school. I was sat there thinking, well, what do I do with this? Now, I'd heard somewhere that apparently what you're supposed to do is hold it to your forehead. So for an hour, I was sat at the kitchen table with this envelope out to my forehead, saying, come on, Whitefeather, if you are who you claim to be, tell me, what has she written on this piece of paper? And after an hour or so, I suddenly saw a riverbank. It was a sunny day and there was a dog running up and down barking. And I thought, oh, that must be it. So I wrote down, dog running up and down, riverbank, sunny day. And I wrote it down and I put it in my pocket. And when she came home, I said, what have you written? What did you write? And she said, well, have a look. So I opened the envelope and I looked and I saw, dog running up and down, riverbank, sunny day, dog barking. And I thought, that's it. That's it. Whitefeather is Whitefeather, totally separate to me. I'm accepting it at long last. Well, I can tell you that certainty lasted for a week. And after the week, I thought, hang on a minute, I know this is telepathy. This is telepathy. So I was back to square one. Back to square one. Could it be telepathy? Because as I say, it's important that we always question ourselves. We want to know the truth. You know, it would be silly just to go along and to deceive ourselves. And then we had the opportunity to sit with Leslie Flint. Now, some of you here obviously know the name Leslie Flint. For those of you who don't, Leslie Flint was perhaps one of the finest direct voice mediums that the country has ever produced. And we had the privilege of sitting with Leslie Flint. And we travelled down to London, my brother, his wife, Sue, my wife, and myself. And I can remember as we sat there in his small seance room in London, and I remember as the light went out, thinking to myself, at last we're going to experience what Arthur Findlay wrote about in On the Edge of the Etheric. Now, I can tell you it was wonderful. You know, to sit there and to listen to the voices of men, women and children talking to their loved ones on this side of life was a privilege. It was fantastic. But I'm going to take you now to perhaps the third visit we made. And I could tell you, I ought to tell you at this point, that I came from a broken home and my grandparents virtually brought me up. So my grandmother was very much a mother figure to me. And she had passed on a matter of weeks, as I remember, prior to us going to Leslie Flint's on the third or fourth occasion. And I should tell you that during the last week of her life, she was taken into hospital, and the whole family, it's a very close, big family, and we all used to descend on the hospital every night to visit her. And then on one occasion, it was decided that I would go on my own to see her. She always said I was her favourite grandson and we were like mother and son, so I was going to go and see her on my own. That night, or the following night, I set off for the hospital. No sooner had I driven away than the phone rang, and Sue answered the phone, and it was an uncle who said, tell Stuart not to go, Gran's had a heart attack, she's not expected to survive, because I'd already gone. And I can tell you that I got to the hospital, I didn't know anything about this. She was in a private ward, she was unconscious. I sat alongside her and I held her hand. Something happened between us. Something happened between us that nobody on earth knew about. 3 weeks later at Leslie Flint, suddenly out of the darkness, she spoke. And she spoke about the funeral, and she mentioned what happened between the two of us. There was only two people that knew that, I was one, and I was upon the earth. She was the other, and she was on the other side. How fantastic is that? So I was thinking of this as she went. Terminology, the way she spoke, there was no question in my mind. It was her. And as the voice faded out, and I'm thinking of this, suddenly another voice came in, white feather, and began to speak. And I thought to myself, this is a golden opportunity to find out at long last, is he who he claims to be? Is he separate to me, or is he an aspect of myself? And I said to him, can I ask a question? And he said, yes. And I said, could you tell me, in life, did you have a physical deformity? And as quick as that, he said, you mean my left hand? And I thought, that's it. That's it. And from that day until this present day, I have never, ever doubted he is who he claims to be. Now, the fact is that he had always said and always promised that one day, if you continue to sit with patience in the correct way, we will manifest in a physical manner. And that was always a hope and always a thought that perhaps the day would come. And then another major event. I met a lady called Kath Matthews. Now, Mrs. Matthews was a Hull girl, that's where I come from, was a Hull girl. She'd gone to live in London and lived in London for quite some years. And then she was a marvellous medium. Her husband had passed into spirit. She'd come back to live in Hull, where her family were. And I was present on the very first occasion that she demonstrated at a spiritualist church. I said it then, and I've said it ever since, and I'll continue to say, she gave, apart from Gordon Higginson, who I had the privilege of seeing, working, she gave the finest demonstration of mediumship that I have ever seen. She was fantastic. And after the service, I was in conversation with her. She found out that I was very, very interested in physical mediumship, and she then suggested that if I cared to go around to her home once a week, she would form a circle around me. She would black out the room for me. And of course I accepted, and I was there for a long, long time. I'm going to say Monday night because I can't really remember. Every Monday night I was there with about a dozen other people. Now, we sat, and as before, Whitefeather would come and he would speak to people. Sometimes he wouldn't come, and it went on like this for a long time. And always, that trumpet sat in the middle of the room, and the bloody thing would not move. and then, another major event. The circle had finished this particular night. Everyone had gone home apart from Kath, another lady and myself, and we were sitting at the table, and that trumpet was in the centre of the table. And we were sitting at the table, and we were drinking tea, and we were talking. Everyone had gone home, as I say, and suddenly, again, Whitefeather controlled me and said, switch the light out. Kath reached up and switched the light out, and as the light went out, so the trumpet for the very first time went up into the air and hovered above the table. Now you can imagine the following week, when everybody turned up for the circle, there was a few very envious people, I can tell you that much. But it was the beginning. It was the beginning. And I want to just share with you a couple of wonderful thing, because this demonstrates, this illustrates the power of the spirit world. And we sat, and this strengthened and got better and better, and voices began to come through the trumpet. What is interesting, does anybody remember the name, or does anybody know the name Lila Josephs? Yeah. Well, Lila Josephs was a London medium. Was it Petticoat Lane or somewhere? She used to wear a bowler hat, didn't she? Yeah, she was in psychic news a lot. She was a great medium. And Kath Matthews was a good friend of Lila Josephs. Lila Josephs passed into spirit through an embolism, I think. Passed into spirit, and suddenly, at the circles, Lila Joseph began to speak through the trumpet, and it was great because they used to reminisce between themselves about things that had happened in the past and so on and so on. It was fantastic. But Lila Joseph always made it clear that she was only there for a short time, that there was a little boy in the background, and one day he would take over, and when that day came, so she would withdraw. So we sat for a long, long time, and one night we sat and absolutely nothing happened at all. Listen to this. Now this is fantastic, and you'll never forget this because I've never forgotten this. And nothing happened all night, nothing at all. And we closed in prayer, we put the light on, and as the light went on, sitting in front of every single member, and there would be about 12 people in the circle, sitting in front of every member of the circle on the carpet was a little plastic animal. Pigs and cows and horses and so on and so on. Little plastic animal in front of every single member apart from Kath. And there was nothing. Well, she was a bit upset. She thought, well, she's given a home to this, and she's blacking out every week for us. She's really taken on a position as my mentor, if you like, and yet the spirit world had failed to recognise this, seemingly. And so we had to, and because Kath was upset, because we were upset as well, we thought, well, it's unbelievable, that the spirit world would do this. But what is interesting is that the following morning, as I was coming down the stairs, the phone was ringing, and when I picked it up, it was Kath. And she said, I've got something to tell you. And I could tell that it was something wonderful by the excitement in her voice. And she said, and apparently every night when she went to bed, she would read a book, and as she was falling asleep, she would close it and put it on a bedside table. And she said to me, last night, she said, I read in a book, closed it up, put it on the bedside table, fell asleep. She said, and when I woke up this morning, the first thing I saw, sitting on the book, was a large pink plastic pig. Isn't that fantastic? Isn't that fantastic? But it doesn't end there, because then everybody who came to the house was shown the plastic pig, the pink plastic pig. And it doesn't end there, because for a long time she kept it in a cabinet, and it would come out and it would be shown to people. And then one day she realised it had gone. And when you lose things, how you search for things you can't find. And she searched high and low, and there was no sign of it, and that was it. So she thought the spirit world must have taken it back. Anyhow, she said about a fortnight later, a guy comes to the house. I can never remember whether he came to fit a carpet or whatever he did. He came into the house, and that trumpet was sitting on the mantelpiece. And when he walked in, he must have known something about spiritualism, because he saw it, and he said, oh, do you have seances here? And she said, yes. And he said, I've got something to tell you. He said, you will understand this. He said, I've tried. I've told people, and everybody thinks I'm mad. He said, but this is the gospel truth. He said, some time ago, he said, I went to bed. He says, and when I woke up next day, he said, there was a big pink plastic pig. Now, this guy lived about 8 miles away from Kath. They'd never met before. And Kath said, well, you won't believe this. And she told him. So he said, look, next time I'm in the area, I'll bring it round. If it's yours, you can have it back. Sometime later, he came back with the pig. She looked at it. She said, it's my plastic pig. He gave her it back. Now, isn't that fantastic? Isn't that fantastic? And this is the power of the Spirit. This is the power of the spirit world. Now I want to move on to... How long have I got you, Jeff? I'm all right. I'm sorry. Great. I've got such a lot to tell you. I want to tell you now of another major event. And that was... It began when Sue and I were on holiday with our children in Wales. And I think we'd been out for a walk. Came back to the car, climbed into the car, put the wireless on, and just heard the end of an interview with a man called Alan Crossley. And he was speaking about his friend Helen Duncan. Alan Crossley, I'd never ever heard of him before, but in the few moments I listened to him, I thought, because I've always been so passionately interested in physical mediumship, you see, and talking to people who have had experiences with these great mediums from the past. And I thought, I must contact him. So I wrote to him, care of Psychic News. They passed it on. And within a week or so, I had a letter from Alan Crossley inviting me to go down to his home. Now, he lived in a little village called Elton, just on the outskirts of Chester. And he lived in a static caravan on an established site. And a guy who subsequently became, if you like, a loyal friend, and we always said my manager, if you like, because he organises everything for me. The two of us travelled over the Pennines to meet Alan Crossley in his home. Now, I can tell you that I had some of the most fantastic days of my entire life in the company of Alan Crossley. He was a pioneer of spiritualism. He wrote several books on spiritualism, including one on Helen Duncan, his friend, and I'm going to tell you some of his stories in a moment. But being in his presence and sitting there listening to his stories was such a privilege. His faith and belief in the spirit world was total and absolute. When you hear some of the stories he told to us, you'll understand exactly why. But Ray and I used to arrive, and we used to go into his caravan, sit in the lounge, and then he used to walk off to the back kitchen and to make a cup of tea, and he used to stand with one foot in the back kitchen and one foot in the lounge, and he'd say, "Now, tea, you like it strong, don't you? Is it 2 sugars? Right, okay. Did I tell you about so-and-so, so-and-so?" And then for about 2 hours, he never moved. But we used to sit there listening to these stories, and they were so fat, we didn't mind. We didn't mind to be there in his presence and to hear these wonderful stories was such a privilege. And he had met, I always thought he'd lived a charmed life, because he had met and known personally these great mediums from the past that we can only read about today. But he knew them, and he was there. He sat with Helen Duncan. Whenever Helen Duncan visited the Liverpool area, then he was in charge of the lights for her. He knew personally Alec Harris. Now, anybody who doesn't know of Alec Harris, he was perhaps the finest materialisation medium that the movement has ever produced. Welshman. He knew, and he sat with Alec Harris. So can I just share a couple of stories with you that Alan told us, and then I'll move on to other things. He told us, he was for a long while, he was a travelling salesman, I think paints. I think it was something to do with paints. And he told us that whenever he visited Cardiff, he always used to stay with a Mr. and Mrs. Harris. And he said it would be some time before he realised that this Mr. and Mrs. Harris he was staying with was actually the brother of the Alec Harris, you see. And through this couple, he got an introduction to Alec Harris and his wife, Louis. And from there, he was invited to take part in seances whenever he was in the area. And the one that sticks out in my mind is the occasion when he said, I sat many times with Alec Harris. He said, and eventually I was trusted so much that I was allowed to sit immediately at the side of the cabinet. He said, and on one occasion, he said, the curtains opened. Alec sat always in black pyjamas within the cabinet. The curtains opened. He said, and this little Arab, this Arab came out of the cabinet in full regalia, in full dress, walked into the circle and began to hold a conversation. He said, a moment later, I heard the curtains go again. He said, and they opened. He said, and this North American Indian, about 6'6" tall, bronzed, came out of the cabinet, walked to another part of the circle and began to hold a conversation with somebody. He said, and then I heard the curtains go again. I looked. He said, then this little Chinaman scurried out. He said, and there was 3 materialised figures all holding conversations. And this, he said, was in good red light. He said, and then he said, I noticed that every now and then, he said, I noticed how the Arab and the Indian would break off the conversation, turn, go back into the cabinet, and then emerge a moment later. He said, and I suddenly thought, they must be going back to recharge the energy in some way. He said, and then I realised that the Chinaman hadn't done this. Of the 3, the Chinaman hadn't done it. He said, and then suddenly it was as if he remembered. He said, and he turned and he began to walk back, scurry back towards the cabinet. He said, and as I watched him in light, coming back to the cabinet, he said, suddenly, he said, I saw that all his features began to crumble. He said, it was like watching wax before a flame. He said, all began to crumble and the figure itself crumbled into the floor, and there was just a mound of ectoplasm on the floor. He said, and it went into the cabinet. What can you say? If you'd had that experience, you would never doubt again for the rest of your life, would you? Fantastic, absolutely. And I can tell you this as well. Now, this came from one of the country's leading psychical researchers who I knew for some years. As a young man, and he sat and he told me this in person. I bet he wouldn't tell anybody else, but he told me. He'd tell people behind closed doors, but he would never admit to this. As a young man, he found out that his local spiritualist church had organised a trip to Cardiff to sit with Alec Harris. Now, spiritualists all over the world wanted to sit with Alec Harris. And as a young man, he heard this and went to see the president of the church and asked if he could join the trip. And the president said, no, I'm sorry, but it's fully booked. He said, but if anybody drops out, he said, you've got first refusal. He said, on the day before the trip, he said, the president came to see him and said, somebody drops out, illness or whatever, there is a place, would you like to come? And he said, yes. And he said, the next morning, he arrived at the church and everybody stood there waiting for the bus to take them to Cardiff. He said, and he noticed there was an old gentleman standing with a bouquet of flowers. He said, and he found out that this gentleman had lost his wife only the week earlier, and he was taking the flowers hoping that she would materialise. He said they went down to Cardiff, went into the I think Alex's seances were held in a bedroom on the first floor. They went up into the seance room. The lights were turned out, a dim red light was put on. He said, and we sat in rows. He said the old gentleman was sat immediately behind me. He said, and we were sitting there, and after a while the curtains opened, some materialised form came out. He said, and I sat there for, it must have been an hour, looking at one figure after another coming out, and all the spiritualists said, oh, it's my mother, oh, it's me. He said, and frankly, he said, I sat and I looked, he said, it was so dim, he said, I couldn't really see. He said, it could have been Alec Harris, for as far as I know. He said, so I decided, oh, it's ridiculous. He said, I was just sat. He said, and after about an hour, he said, suddenly, he said, the curtains opened. He said, and every hair on the back of my neck stood up. He said, this little old lady scurried out from the cabinet, and as she did, this old gentleman jumped up, pushed me out the way, shouted it. He said it was his wife. He says, I've never seen anything like it. He said it was so emotional. He said they embraced. He said he said she must have been there 5 minutes, maybe longer. He said there was no question. He said it must have been his wife. He was convinced it was. It was fantastic. He said, and then suddenly, he said, I noticed that she began to sink down. He said, and as she's sinking down, he said, I looked and her feet had gone. He said, and she's sinking down towards the floor. And as she's sinking down, so he's going down with his bouquet, going down with her. He said, and at the end, he said, there's a head on the floor. He's on his hands and knees. She's saying, I've got to go, I've got to go. And he's saying, don't go, don't go. And she's saying, I've got to go. He said, and literally there was a head, her head, and that's all. He said, and it just went into the floor, and the ectoplasm went back into the cabinet. What can you say? And spiritually, many spiritualists today say, there's no need for physical mediumship anymore. It belongs to the past. What does that mean? If you had the opportunity to go and sit with Alec Harris, to greet again your mother, father, brother, daughter, loved one, wouldn't you jump at the opportunity? I would. Yeah. I'd be the first there. I think this is fantastic. This is spiritualism. Spiritualism, as Jeff said, was born in the mid-1800s in America, and it was like a forest fire. It spread right through America, right through Europe, and right through England. And as it did, the adherents, the people were converted in millions. Men of letters, men of the arts, aristocracy, royalty, people from every walk of life were succumbing to this astounding new philosophy that said it could prove the survival of the human soul beyond death. You know, this is wonderful. This is spiritualism. This is spiritualism. Whatever has happened in the last, and I think it's generally recognised, in the last 30 years or so, somehow it's lost direction. It has lost, and I personally believe it's because it stopped listening to the spirit world. And when you stop listening to the spirit world, then you lose direction, because we can't do it on our own. It's a team effort. It's a partnership, the spirit world and our world. And if we lose that, we lose everything. Rather like the established church, you know. It's ridiculous, but this is the nitty-gritty of spiritualism. This is what should infuse us all with enthusiasm, you know, to take this message out into the world. This is spiritualism. Where am I? I forgot. So Alan Crossley decided that he would form a circle around me. I was always having circles formed around me. I've been very fortunate. And once a month, Ray and I would travel to Elton, to his home, and he carefully selected the sitters. And we would sit together. And I can tell you, we had such wonderful, wonderful times there. And I want to tell you of one occasion, one summer's day, when Ray and I arrived. It was a beautiful day, the sun was shining, and there was a strong breeze. We went into Alan's home, and we sat, and as always, Alan was stood with one foot in the lounge and one foot in the back kitchen, regaling us. And we were sat there, and I noticed that he had left. He'd pulled down the blind part of the way from one of the windows, and there was a big, large vase of flowers standing immediately in front of this blind. And every now and then the wind coming through the window would catch it, and the blind would hit the vase. And this was happening for perhaps a quarter of an hour or so. It was very noticeable. You could hear this. And I kept glancing every time it hit the vase. And then suddenly it hit the vase, and the vase fell from the table. And I looked, Ray looked, my sister Gay looked, we all looked as this vase fell towards the carpet. And as it fell towards the carpet, we saw all this water shoot out together with the flowers, and it bounced on the floor. And Alan said, "Oh my God." And he went in the back kitchen, got a cloth, came back, went down on his hands and knees, and he's doing this. And then suddenly he sat up and he started to laugh. And we said, "What?" He said, "Come and feel." And we went down on the floor, and we felt, and the floor, the carpet was totally dry. No moisture, it was totally and absolutely dry. This is absolute truth, I'm telling you now. The carpet was absolutely dry. And for the rest of the afternoon, of course, we'd talked about nothing else. God, you know, and we'd seen it hit the carpet. But the story doesn't end there. The story ends 6 hours later in the séance room. We'd been sitting for most of the séance when suddenly the little boy who had by then began to work through me, Christopher, suddenly said, "Would you like a present?" And we all said, "Oh yes." And with that there was a whoosh, and all this water descended. And we were all soaked. But it didn't matter. It was the only time in my life I was delighted to be soaked, you know. And somehow, Alan said, somehow the spirit world had suspended, taken that water before it actually hit the carpet, and suspended it somewhere, goodness knows where, only to return it to us 6 hours later. Oh, isn't that fantastic? That is unbelievable, but it's the truth, absolute truth. And there was another, I could regale you all night with these stories, but there was another occasion. One of the ladies had a necklace, and the clasp, or whatever it's called, had broken on it, and she couldn't actually take it off. And she tried and struggled with it. Before she came to the séance, she couldn't get it off. She came along for the for the circle, and she sat in the circle, and after the circle, as she walked into the lounge, she realised that it had gone, the necklace. Everybody went back into the séance room searching for this necklace, not a sign of it anywhere. It had gone, and she said, "Well, it's impossible." She said, "I couldn't take it off because of the clasp or whatever it's called. She said, I couldn't take it off. She said, it's impossible. It must be there somewhere. So Alan said, look, leave it. I'll have a really good look after you've gone. So she went home, and that night she couldn't sleep. And about 3 o'clock in the morning, she told me this personally, about 3 o'clock in the morning, she said, I'll get up and I'll make a cup of tea. She got up, she went and made a cup of tea, she had a cup of tea, she came back, and as she walked into the bedroom, the first thing she saw was a necklace laid on a pillow. Isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? Again, if you have experiences like that, how can you doubt? How would you ever doubt? And then the Noah's Ark Society came along. And the Noah's Ark Society commenced probably 15, 18 years ago with great hopes of reversing the decline of physical mediumship, because by then, 15, 18 years ago, it had virtually gone, apart from Gordon Higginson probably. And so it had great hopes to arrest this decline in physical mediumship. And I was appointed its archives officer, and I was very fortunate some years later to be appointed its president. It had great hopes. Whilst I was the archives officer, I was very, very fortunate to interview many elderly spiritualists who in years gone by had had experiences with these great mediums from the past. And I'd like to just share with you a couple of experiences that I heard from very, very creditable people, intelligent people. These are not people that would have exaggerated in any way. This is what happened to them. And the first experience I want to tell you about came from a man called Bill Cookson, who has since passed into spirit. Bill Cookson lived in Perth in Scotland. I met him on numerous occasions in Blackpool. He used to go take his vacations, his holidays in Blackpool, and it was there that I met him, but I corresponded with him for a long time. And Bill's whole life really changed when he was about 18 years of age. And he had lived on a few moments in time from the age of 18 into his into old age. And he told me that he knew nothing about spiritualism when he was 18. I think it was a building site he was working on, but there was a man there who was a very big spiritualist, and this man told him, I think it was his foreman, told him that we have a famous medium coming to Scotland, coming to Perth, by the name of Helen Duncan. You think spiritualism is ridiculous. Would you accept my invitation and accompany me to the public seance? And he went along for a laugh. In his own words, he went along for a laugh. He thought it would be a huge jolly for him to go. And he went. He said, I wasn't in the least nervous. He said, I sat there. He said, and I saw one person after another supposedly coming out of the cabinet, supposed to have been people's loved ones. He said, I couldn't tell. It was pretty dark. He said, and then suddenly, he said, the curtains opened and a man came out and walked straight across to me, and as I looked at him, I realised it was my brother. He said, I was absolutely terrified. Absolutely. He said, and he held out his hands for me to take. He said, and I couldn't take them. He said, and I've regretted that for the rest of my life. He said, but I've lived my life on those few moments. There is no doubt whatsoever it was my brother who had only died a couple of years earlier. That's fantastic. How wonderful is that? How wonderful is that? That was one story. And the other one I want to share with you came from a man called Norman Stacey in Craghead. Has anybody heard of Craghead? One or two. Craghead in the northeast. Craghead, a little mining village. Its claim to fame is a man called Hunter Selkirk. Hunter Selkirk was a brilliant physical medium. And there is a book, if you can get hold of it, I urge you to do so, called Listen, My Son. And Listen, My Son was written by a man called Harry Emerson. And Harry Emerson wrote a series of letters to his son who was fighting in the Second World War, telling his son about the seances he attended with Hunter Selkirk and how his wife, the boy's mother, regularly materialised, that he embraced her, that he spoke to her. And so it was a series of letters, and from that was born the book, Listen, My Son. And I met Norman Stacey, he's just passed into spirit about a year ago himself. I met him probably about 15 years ago, and he told me that when he was quite young, Hunter Selkirk befriended him. And Hunter Selkirk used to take him around to the various churches where he was demonstrating clairvoyance. He said that he was so popular a medium it was impossible to get in. People used to stand in the streets outside to try and hear him. But he also had his physical mediumship. And Hunter Selkirk was Norman Stacey was very, very privileged to belong the home circle for a while with Hunter Selkirk as medium. And he said there was unbelievable things took place in that seance room. He said, and I shall tell you of a few. And he told me of an occasion when he and Harry Emerson and Hunter Selkirk were coming back from a demonstration. It was a beautiful summer's night. He said, we went to Harry Emerson's home. We went in, we sat at the table having a drink, and Hunter suddenly said, shall we have a seance? And Harry Emerson jumped up, closed the curtains. He said, but it was still light. It was a summer's night. He said, we sat there. He said, Hunter was sat at the head of the table. Harry Emerson was there. He said, and I was there. He said, we sat there, and Hunter said, put your hands on the table. He said, we all put our hands on the table. He said, the next thing, his head fell on his chest, and he fell into trance. He said, and as we're looking, he said, so these two streams of ectoplasm came from his nose out onto the table into two piles, if you like, two mounds of ectoplasm. He said, and then suddenly they began to grow. One was in front of Harry Emerson, he said, and the other was in front of me. He said, and they grew and grew till they reached about 12 inches in height. He said, and as we're looking, he said, so all these features began to emerge from the ectoplasm. He said, until eventually facing us was a man and a woman, both in Elizabethan dress. He said, we could see the tiny little buckles, the lace of the cuffs. He said, and these were animated forms. He said, and as we're looking, he said, so they both did this and bowed to us. He said, and then they crumbled back into two mounds, went back into Hunter. He said, well, you could imagine. He says, and when Hunter came out of trance, he says, has anything happened? Well, unbelievable. Now, I hadn't got Hunter, just simply Norman Stacey's word for this, but last year, my sister Gaynor and I went to Craighead Church and met an elderly lady, church committee member, who had known Hunter. She said, I was only a young girl at the time. She said, and I had the opportunity to attend these seances. She said, but sometimes the local hop came along. She said, and of course I was a teenager. She said, I'd rather go to the dance. She said, when I think now what I missed. And they took us into the room, what they held as the seance room, and she was able to say, Hunter sat there. Hunter. And when Hunter was sat there, she said you could hear all these little children chatting away in the far corner. And the guard speaking to them would say, will you be quiet? She said it was fantastic, fantastic. But Norman Stacey also told me that the home circle was held in the home of an old lady. And he said that Hunter's brother was in charge of the lighting. And Hunter's brother worked shifts. When Hunter's brother was there, he would control the lighting, he said, and it would be so dim. He said, the first thing that would happen would be the curtains would part and this little coloured girl would come out, Topsy. He said, and all you could see was the whites of her eyes and her gleaming teeth. He said, then she would go and she would sit on the old lady's knee, the circle lady's knee, and there she would stay for the full seance as figure after figure would materialise and come out backwards and forwards. He said, but, he said, when Hunter's brother was on night shift, he said, then we took the opportunity to turn the lighting up a bit. He said, it was fantastic. He said, but I'm going to tell you of one occasion, he said, when little Topsy came out, this little coloured girl, she came out of the cabinet, she walked across to the old lady and she sat on her knee. He said, and the seance continued, as it always did, and then the old lady suddenly said, Topsy, I want to ask you a question. Are you really a little girl? She said, because sometimes when we ask you questions, when you reply to the questions, it seems to suggest you're a lot older than you appear to be. And Topsy said, well, as a matter of fact, she said, I'm a lot older than what I appear to be. And the old lady said, will we ever see you as you really are? She said, you can see me tonight if you wish. So she said, if you decide to see me, she said, unfortunately, she said, it'll be the end of the seance. We won't be able to do any more. And they all thought it was too good an opportunity to miss. And they said, Topsy, we would love to see you. So Norman Stacey said she walked back until she was standing in front of the cabinet and she stood in a crucifix position like this. And she said, turn the light up. He said, and as we're watching, the light went up. He said, and as the light went up, he said, so we saw she began to grow and grow and grow and grow. He said, until after a few minutes, he said, standing in front of us was a perfectly formed, totally naked white girl. He said, and as we watched, so then she began to, and the ectoplasm went back into the cabinet. How wonderful. How wonderful is that? How wonderful, wonderful, wonderful is that? You know, I find these things very, very moving because I always think spiritualists who say there's no place for physical mediumship anymore, they can't possibly understand what physical mediumship is about. They cannot possibly understand what it's about. If it's to prove the survival of the soul beyond death, and what better evidence can we have than to see with our own eyes and to hear with our own ears, to embrace people who we have lost from our physical world, to be able to do that? That's priceless. There is no price to that. And that is spiritualism. At least that should be spiritualism. You see, I believe a lot of people may think that perhaps I'm saying that physical mediumship is more important than mental. No, I'm not. I'm not. Because the truth is that it's the quality of evidence which is important. And if we receive that through mental mediumship, such as Estelle Roberts could give on the Kingsway Hall, that she could fill the Kingsway Hall many, many times over, and people would flock to hear her because the evidence she gave was that precise, that wonderful. And that is what spiritualism is, or should be about, the evidence of survival. And whether that comes through physical mediumship or mental mediumship, to me it's immaterial, providing it's there, and that's what's important. Now, perhaps I could tell you a little bit about my own development and what subsequently happened to it and the home circle. Could I say that the home circle now, as it exists, has sat for 25 years? 25 years, the same sitters sitting together. And I think this is important. You know, I've many times over the years, I've met people who desperately want to develop physical contact with the spirit world. And the times I've heard people say, I've said to them, how's the circle going? And they've said, it's disbanded, but I've got a fantastic circle now. Oh, we're like this, all of us. Marvellous. We've been sitting for 6 months. Wonderful atmosphere, wonderful harmony. A year later, I've met them. I said, how's the circle got? It's disbanded. You see, and you hear it so often. And one of the most difficult things of all is to get together a group of like-minded people who are prepared to sit under any cost together to sit together, to give them, to commit themselves, not to say, well, I can't go tonight because Coronation Street's good, or, you know, or I want to watch Britain's Got Talent or something like that. It's a commitment to the spirit world. And if you say we are sitting on a Tuesday night at 7:30, then you'll jolly well sit on a Tuesday night at 7:30. You know, it's as simple as that. And so for 25 years, we have sat and understand what I'm about to tell you is not boasting, it's not egotism, it is nothing like that. But perhaps, because I always believe in what Alan Crossley once said, and that is, a medium should never speak about themselves, that's for other people to do. And I agree with that entirely. But my position is somewhat unique, and perhaps I can share, you know, what we have experienced with you. And if that makes just one person decide for themselves, yes, let's form a circle, or if it enthuses a circle who's here this evening to continue on, to know that it's all worthwhile, then that's what it's all about, isn't it? You know, there is no point at all in people keeping things to themselves, you know, because in that way it doesn't grow. You know, everybody starts from the baseline in that case. And also, I've made many, many mistakes over the years, many mistakes. And if I can help other people not to fall into the same trap and to make the same mistakes, then that's fabulous. You know, that's marvellous. And that's my job done. That's great. So, if I can say that the circle, the development of the circle has been excruciatingly slow. So on occasions, but always been there, and we've had faith, confidence and trust in the spirit world. Simple as that. And I've always thought as well, if the spirit world could develop our circle, or any circle, quicker to accelerate the development, then they would do so, obviously, because they must find it very frustrating. But the fact is that they have a duty, as we've often heard them say, to protect the health and the welfare and the well-being of all, not just the medium, but all of the sitters. And they always err on the side of caution, and they will never take risks. Just once, and I'll tell you about that in a few moments. So we sat. We now use 2 trumpets. This is interesting. We use 2 trumpets. And the first time this happened was probably about 10 years ago. And that is, both the trumpets were up. When they first used to go, they used to be almost, well, we could say frantic. They used to dash all over the room, to the ceiling, to the floor, to the wall. They never ever do they touch anyone. Or if they do touch someone, then they do it always gently. They would never bash anybody, you know, or anything like that. Never, never. And they're always very gentle in what they do. But the 2 trumpets will fly all over or used to fly all over the room at a tremendous speed. Now, I'm pleased to say, and I much prefer it, that it's very, and I won't say slow, but very more controlled, very sedate, and I like that. But this happened probably 10, 12 years ago. Both trumpets were up. One was at the far side of the circle, and one was rather close to me, probably about there. And a voice was coming through this, and my sister Gaynor, she was listening, and she was trying to hear, because it was so quiet, this voice coming through, and she was trying to hear, to relay to the rest of the circle what was being said. And suddenly, the people at the other end of the circle said, we know, it's coming through this trumpet, loud and clear. And we called it stereo voice. Yeah. And sometimes the same voice would be coming through the 2 trumpets at different ends of the circle. That's marvellous. You know, absolutely marvellous. It doesn't always happen. In fact, it very rarely happens. But it does happen. It does happen. So that was the main thing, I think, trumpet phenomena, because I think anybody that comes to the circle, I think it's important for them to see how the spirit world are able to manipulate physical matter. Now, I'll just concentrate just now on the phenomena, and I'll talk about the evidential side of it. Passing matter through matter. They do this, and the way that they do it is that I always... when I worked publicly, I always insisted that because I was a stranger to most of the people that sat, they didn't know me, I didn't know them. And I thought it was important to try to instill in people a degree of confidence. So they knew it could be me that's doing things. So I wanted, for my own sake, I wanted people to have confidence that whatever happened, it couldn't be me. So I always insisted on, which I still do, having luminous tape on my knees so everybody knows where I am. And also, we use cable ties, you know. And what the spirit world do now with visitors is to get a visitor to come and sit at my side and then tell them to hold my hand, which they do. Then with the other hand, they feel the strap to make absolutely certain it's there round the chair arm and round my arm. And then they will say, Walter, who works through me, will say, would you be impressed if I could pass Stuart's arm through the strap? And the person would always say yes, and then Walter says, yes, well, I would be as well. But then he does it. He lifts my arm up and leaves the strap on the chair. Sometimes he will take the strap with it and present it to the person. It's fantastic. You know, absolutely fantastic. We've seen this happen many, many times. Sometimes we also have two ties, two plastic rings which are separate rings on the table, and then sometimes he will join the two and give. Now the first time he ever did it, I have to tell you that whatever they do in private in the home circle, later they then reproduce in a public sense. And they had been working for a long time on this passage of matter through matter, and the first time they decided to do it publicly was the only time I knew that they made a mistake. And it was the medium Mary Armour from Scotland, who was quite well known, who was sat on my right holding my hand, and then they took my arm through the strap, but unfortunately they rematerialised the strap before my arm was through it, with the result was a big burn mark on my arm. Well, what's really interesting is that the following morning Mary Armour was running around showing everybody she had a burn on her arm. Look! Well, it's marvellous, you know. They never made that mistake again, but they did that. And also we have a table with a glass top and a red light on it, and the spirit people materialise the hands so everyone can see on the table, which is pretty fantastic. Also, I'm awake for most of the phenomena now, so I can see it myself, which is a privilege, you know, absolutely marvellous. But more than that, we've had... Oh, and also, we have a gentleman called Dr. Barnett, and Dr. Barnett materialises as flesh and blood, and he comes out of the cabinet. One of the things he does do, with great success, is healing. And to give you an example, there's a lady called Katie Halliwell. Katie Halliwell has written 2 books. She's actually writing 3 about our home circle. Katie was born deaf. She's totally deaf. In the pitch blackness, obviously she hears nothing. She can't lip read, nothing like this. So she was always frightened about coming along the first time to sit in our seance room. She realised once the lights went out, she would hear nothing. She would just sit literally in the pitch blackness. And then the spirit people told her, not prophesied, but told her that she would write books about the circle, and it was important that she would hear everything that took place to enable her to write. And from then on, they began to work on something, a device, we don't know what it is, but when she sits there in the pitch black, as soon as the seance begins, she feels something being lowered onto her head. She says it feels like a bonnet coming down on her head. And at that moment, she can hear, and she hears absolutely everything that takes place in the seance. As soon as the seance is finished, then she can't hear again. You know, now how wonderful is that? The spirit people have said, unfortunately, they would never be able to extend that beyond the seance room. I think that's fantastic. And again, it shows the power of the spirit world. Now, over the years, we have a guest circle on a Thursday night. People come from all over the world to say. And over the years, many, many times, people after the seance have come to me and said, thank you, my mother came, or my father came, or whoever came and spoke, whoever. And I've never ever known how to respond to that. I've been delighted for them, obviously I've been delighted. But I've always said, oh, I'm so pleased for you. And that was it. I didn't really know how to respond. And I am genuinely pleased for people. Until about 4 years ago, and then we had a lady came to sit with us. And I always tell this story. I find it moving, but I think it's a defining moment for me. And that is, whenever anybody rings, telephones Ray, whose home the seances are held in, whenever anybody rings, he always gives them the 3rd degree. He always, as far as he's concerned, nobody comes through into our seance room unless he knows that he can trust them. Because physical mediumship can be handled incorrectly, you know, it can pose great danger to the medium if a light should come on at the wrong time or anything like this. So Ray's very, very careful. Sometimes he can be half an hour on the phone with people, making sure, giving them the 3rd degree, making sure that they are who they claim to be, blah, 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 blah. So he had this lady ring from London, and he said sometimes, you know, he said, you get the feeling, you get the impression whether you can trust people. He said, and something in me said, yes, I can trust this lady. So she was invited to come. We didn't know anything about her at all, other than the fact she was from London. When I arrived that night, she was introduced to me. We shook hands. She was a very slim lady, a very slim lady, very few words. She appeared to be very shy. She said very, very little. And at 8 o'clock, as always, we went up into the seance room and we sat. And all I can say to you is that 2 hours later, when we came down the stairs, the lady who came down the stairs was not the lady who went up the stairs. What none of us knew when she went up there was that 2 years earlier, she'd lost a partner to whom she was extremely close, and lost him very unexpectedly, lost him. From that moment on, she couldn't eat, she couldn't sleep, she'd considered suicide, she was a total and absolute wreck. When we went down the stairs, she came to me, put her arms around me and said, just want to thank you for saving my life. And when she said that, I thought, well, that's why we've sat all these years. And if you can help people in that way, this is spiritual, isn't it? This is what it's all about. And from that moment on, I realised just what it is we've been doing there all these years. And now I'd like to make it very personal, if I can, and end by telling you that after 25 years sitting on my left-hand side, my sister Gaynor died in a tragic road accident only a few months ago. Now, the thought of sitting again without her being there after 25 years was it was unthinkable. It was absolutely unthinkable. And for 3 weeks we didn't meet, and on the 4th week we got together just to sit and talk downstairs, not to go into the seance room, and we talked together. And then we did that for 2 weeks, and the next week, the 3rd week, we sat downstairs, not in the seance room, and we had a little sitting, and Frida, one of our main communicators, came and spoke to us about it. Eventually, some weeks later, we went back up into the seance room. It was very, very difficult. Gaynor's youngest daughter, Lindsay, she'd been a member of the circle for 2 years, and I asked her if she would take her mum's place sitting on my left, which she's done. Now I tell you this, within a week of her passing, Ray sent me an email he'd received from a lady in America, a doctor of psychology, who'd worked with the bereaved, was a bereavement counsellor. She worked with people who were terminal, who were dying, and she had written to Ray, she'd emailed Ray saying she knew nothing whatsoever about physical mediumship. She'd seen Katie Halliwell's books advertised on Amazon, and she'd sent for them, and she couldn't believe what she was reading. Would Stuart Alexander consider coming over to America? And Ray sent this and said, what do you think? So I looked at it, and you know, sometimes in life, I don't know what it is, but something is telling you something. And I thought, I went to make contact with this lady, and I didn't know why. I had no idea why. And I emailed her, and she emailed back. She couldn't believe that she'd actually got an email from me when a fortnight before she didn't even know about physical mediumship. And she emailed me, and then a correspondence began between her. And she'd written 2 books, Halfway Across the River and Shall We Dance? And she sent a copy of both, and she'd inscribed both of them to me. I then wrote to her and said about Gaynor, and I knew from what she'd said that she had a certain mediumistic gift, though she didn't practice it. I said, just if you pick anything up you think might be significant, do let me know. And I left it at that. And within a day I received an email from her with some things. She'd just been to church, she'd just got back, she thought she'd made contact, and she said, take this for what it is. If you can accept it, great. If you can't, well, you know, just accept it in the grace in which it was given. And I looked at it and I thought, good God. Well, the first thing she'd put was that Gaynor is talking about something to do with a snake from a childhood that made a great impression on her. I thought, my God. And the truth about that, and nobody knew this, only Gaynor and myself, we laughed about it so often. And the truth is, now you're all going to go, ugh. But this is the truth. When I was a little boy, I wanted a grass snake. And I got a grass snake, but having got the grass snake, I was terrified of it. So I got a big tin, put holes in the top, put it in the tin, put the top on. And then I understood that you put maggots, you fed maggots to the snake, you see, this way. So I used to drop maggots in. I never looked at the snake for bloody weeks. And I put these maggots in. And then one day at school, the school teacher said, look, if anybody's got any unusual pets, would you care to bring them in tomorrow? I thought, I'd take my grass snake. So I went home, and Gaynor and I went to the tin. We took the top off, only to discover that the maggots had eaten the snake. Now I know, it's ghastly, isn't it? But I can tell you, since then, we have laughed so often about this. When we're told of the people, you see, we've laughed. And I thought, my God, when I'd read this. And then she'd written something about, Gaynor is talking about some flowers with long stalks and purple, small purple heads, which is very significant. And I thought, what? So I rang Lindsay, and I said, Lindsay, and I said one or two things. She said, yeah, this is this, that's that. And I said, Lindsay, I said, what? According to this lady, she's talking about, and I described the flowers, does it mean anything? She said, no. So I finished the conversation, put the phone on, and I should tell you it was Mother's Day. It was Mother's Day. Then a minute later the phone rang, and I picked it up, and it was Lindsay. She said, Lisa, her sister, is here. She said, and as soon as I started telling Lisa, she said, Lindsay, turn round. She said, I turned round. She said, I can't bear. She said, and I'd been out that morning. She said, and I bought a big bouquet of flowers for my mum with long stalks and little purple heads. I said, there you are, Lindsay. I said, your mum even knew that you'd got those flowers for her. Isn't that fantastic? And the last piece came from, so there was a connection there, and the lady sent copies of her books to Lindsay and to Lisa as well. It's been such a comfort. And the last piece of evidence came just before we came here to the New Forest, and that was on the morning that was due to set off. A text came from Mary Armour, and she put, Gaynor says, don't forget to take your boots. And what's interesting here is that for 2 days I've been thinking to myself, I must remember to take them boots. I must remember, where can I put them? And I'd just taken them and put them by the front door so as not to forget. And the text came through. Gaynor says, don't forget to take your boots. I thought, oh, isn't that fantastic? Isn't that totally fantastic? You know, and you see, what's important is this: of all the within a week of Gaynor passing, we had emails from all over the world, people who knew her, who had been to the circle, who knew her personally, and they were all coming. And what we found marvellous was the fact that not a single one even so much as suggested, because I was who I was, or that I was a spiritualist, I knew what I knew, that it would make the loss any easier to take. Of course it doesn't. Yeah. Eventually, if we're spiritualists and we know what we know, eventually the day comes, as Frida, our spirit communicator, said, when great comfort can be derived from that. But initially, that loss hits you and strikes you. It doesn't matter whether you're a Buddhist, whether you're Jewish, whether you're a Hindu, a spiritualist, or what you are. You know, a physical loss is a physical loss, and it's terribly difficult to live with. I hope you've enjoyed listening to it. I tell you, I could stand here till 12 o'clock and I still wouldn't. But I really have enjoyed being able to share these few experiences with you. And I know Jeff's been asking me for a long time to come here to Bournemouth, and it's been my privilege to talk to you all. And I hope you've enjoyed the talk, and I hope you will take away with you renewed enthusiasm for this wonderful, wonderful movement of spiritualism of ours. Thank you for listening.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, wasn't that a wonderful evening?
Yeah.
I could have listened to your stories all night. I feel sorry that I had to call the time about 9 o'clock this evening, but there we are. It was a wonderful, truly wonderful evening. Been looking forward to it for ages. I just have one or two very, very quick notices for you, ladies and gentlemen. Tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock, the medium will be John Harvey for an afternoon of mediumship. And this Saturday we have Mark Stone. No, we don't. We have Mark Brandis. I do apologise. Confusing the medium. We have Mark Brandis. He will be giving an evening of mediumship at 7:30 this Saturday, and there will be a charge at the door. And Mark will also be with us Sunday for the morning and evening demonstrations as well. We have two very special people here this evening, ladies and gentlemen. The first you've listened to for the last hour and a half, and it's been a great privilege to listen to Stuart. The second is a special lady who tomorrow has a very special birthday. And I won't say how old she is, but I just ask you to have your singing voice ready for Wynne Clark, because tomorrow she has a very special birthday. So can you please join us to sing Happy Birthday to Wynne? That was a very, very beautiful evening, and I'm sure you all really enjoyed it. But it's very, very wonderful to know that that dedication towards spirit is still alive. It's not just the mediums of the past, but it's still very much alive today. We've heard Stuart's journey, which has been absolutely incredible. To know the length of time and the dedication is given to spirit to get the results that his mediumship has brought, and to the comfort it's given to so many people. Can you please once again show your appreciation to Stuart?